December 24th, 1944. Camp, Atlanta, Nebraska. The air in Barrack C was frigid, thick with the metallic tang of the coal stove and the sour smell of 20 men braced for the worst. Kenji Tanaka kept his eyes fixed on the gray wool blanket bunched at his feet. Beside him, Toshiro, a young enlistee captured near Leyte, was vibrating, his teeth chattering from more than the cold. The rumors had been specific. Christmas, a Western ritual of dominance. The guards, usually bored and indifferent, had been tense all day. End quote. "They will make a sport of us," Toshiro whispered, his voice cracking. Like the stories from China. Kenji rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. The contact was firm, almost harsh. "Show them nothing." The barracks door slammed open, rattling the loose window panes. A young American private stood silhouetted against the blinding white of the snow-covered plains. He held a clipboard, not a rifle. "Block C. Dinner detail. On your feet." This was it. The punishment. They were being marched to the mess hall for the execution of the Christmas special they had been promised. Kenji pushed himself up, his muscles aching. He felt the cold floorboards through his thin socks. He prepared his mind, closing it off. He would endure the humiliation. He would not give the white devils the satisfaction of his fear. We explore these hidden moments where humanity was tested, and we invite you to subscribe and share in the comments which country's story you would like to see next. 6 weeks earlier, the Philippine Sea. The world was water and fire. 6 weeks before he would ever feel the impossible dry cold of Nebraska, Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka was drowning in the warm, suffocating humidity of the Philippine Sea. His Zero, crippled not by enemy fire, but by a catastrophic engine failure, a betrayal of good steel had fallen from the sky. He remembered the violent shudder, the smell of burning oil, and then the sickening final impact with the ocean. He had unlatched the canopy and dragged himself out, his flight suit instantly heavy, his lungs aching for air. He kicked away from the sinking wreckage, his pride a heavier weight than his waterlogged boots. A failure. He had not died in battle. He had not taken an enemy with him. He had simply fallen. The American destroyer emerged from the morning haze like a gray predator. Kenji watched it approach, his hand instinctively moving to the Nambu pistol at his hip, but it was gone, swallowed by the sea. He had only 2 choices: drown himself, fulfilling his duty. The rope ladder scraped his cheek as they hauled him aboard. The American sailors were loud, their voices booming with a harsh language that sounded like barking. They were giants, red-faced from the sun, smelling of sweat and machine oil. Kenji braced himself for the blow. The boot. The bullet. It was what he had been trained to expect. It was what his superiors had assured him would happen. The White Devils took no prisoners, only trophies. Instead, rough hands searched him, efficient and impersonal. They stripped him of his ruined flight suit. A man with a red cross on his helmet shone a light in his eyes, then spoke in rapid, angry-sounding tones to another man. A different sailor, older, with tired eyes, pushed a metal cup of water into his hand, followed by a dry biscuit, a piece of American hardtack. Kenji stared at it. The biscuit was an offense, a mockery. He dashed it to the deck. The sailor simply sighed, picked up the biscuit, and tossed it overboard. He did not strike Kenji. He just looked. Tired. The journey to America was a blur of disorientation. He was kept below decks, part of a growing collection of Japanese prisoners gathered from disparate islands. They were processed, tagged, and transferred to a transport ship, a floating steel box smelling of rust and despair. The rules of capture, he was discovering, were not glorious or brutal, but bureaucratic. When they finally docked in San Francisco, they were herded off the ship before dawn, marched under armed guard onto a train. The shades were pulled down. For days, they traveled inland, the rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels the only measure of time. They were fed twice a day more biscuits, stew, and bitter coffee. It was sustenance without humanity. Then, the train stopped. They were marched out into a world that had lost all color. The air was so cold it felt like glass in his lungs. Kenji, having known only the humidity of Kure and the tropical heat of the Pacific, had never imagined cold like this. It was a physical assault. In front of him, stretching into a flat, white infinity, was Camp Atlanta, Nebraska. A city of black tar paper barracks, behind endless lines of barbed wire. The guards here were different. They were not sailors. They were young, bundled in thick coats, their breath pluming in the air. They looked bored. Barracks C. A guard mumbled, pointing. End of the line. Kenji pulled the collar of his thin jacket tighter. He looked at the wire. He looked at the snow. He thought of the sailor's biscuit, a gesture he had mistaken for weakness. Now, surrounded by this vast, frozen emptiness, he understood. The barracks were little more than long, black sheds, hastily constructed from tar paper and thin pine. They offered minimal resistance to the wind, which carried no scent of salt or vegetation, only the sterile bite of ice. Kenji and the others were shoved inside Barracks C. The interior was a single, long room, lined with 2 tiers of crude wooden bunks. A single, pot-bellied stove in the center radiated a pathetic circle of warmth that did not reach the corners. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and the faint, ever-present odor of the latrine ditch outside. He was assigned a top bunk. His mattress was a thin canvas sack filled with straw that rustled noisily beneath him. The days that followed were a brutal education in survival, not against violence, but against the environment and the crushing weight of monotony. The intake process was methodical. They were stripped, dusted with delousing powder that stung their skin and filled their nostrils with a sharp chemical smell, and given showers, the water alternating between scalding and freezing. Then came the new uniform. It was not a uniform of honor, but of shame. They were handed coarse wool trousers, a shirt, and a heavy jacket, all dyed a dull, anonymous olive drab. Stenciled in bright yellow paint on the back of the shirt and the thigh of the trousers was the one word that defined their new existence. P.W. Kenji held the jacket. The wool was rough, but it was heavy. It was warm. This was the first contradiction. They were branded, yes, but they were also being protected from the killing cold. A devil would have let them freeze. He was processed by a bored-looking corporal who took his name, rank, and serial number, noting it all on a form. Then, another man, this one in a civilian suit, not a uniform, asked him questions in broken Japanese. He represented the International Red Cross. He handed Kenji a small postcard, explaining he was allowed to write to his family. Kenji almost laughed. What would he write? I have failed. I am alive. I am in a place called Nebraska. The gesture was absurd. Another layer of this soft, confusing captivity. In Barracks C, he met the others. Most were infantry, captured in the island-hopping campaigns. They were young, terrified, and already hollowed out by the experience. Among them was Toshiro, a radio operator barely 20 years old, captured near Leyte. Toshiro attached himself to Kenji, mistaking the officer's rigid silence for strength. They will work us to death, won't they, Lieutenant? Toshiro whispered that first night, his voice trembling in the dark. They have not yet, Kenji replied, his voice flat. He would not show fear, and he would not offer false comfort. It was during their second week, on a forced march to the camp clinic for inoculations, that Kenji saw them. Through a separate, internal barbed wire fence, he saw another compound, identical to their own but for the men inside it. They were tall, many of them blonde. They were German prisoners, They were playing soccer in the snow. Kenji stopped, Toshiro bumping into him from behind. The Germans were loud, shouting at each other in their guttural language. They looked robust. Their faces were pink from the cold, not gaunt from starvation. They moved with an energy Kenji had not seen since before his capture. His propaganda training had insisted all Axis prisoners were treated with the same subhuman disdain. But these men were not broken. They were not starving. They were playing. A guard nuded Kenji forward with his rifle butt, a gentle push, not a blow. Kenji obeyed, but his mind locked on the image. The healthy Germans. The warm PW jacket on his back. The Red Cross postcard tucked in his pocket. Nothing was as it should be. The enemy was not behaving like an enemy. He was being kept alive, clothed, and catalogued. And this lack of overt cruelty felt like a more insidious kind of psychological warfare. He did not understand the rules of this place. Kenji attempted to impose order on the chaos. He woke before the camp bell, performed his calisthenics in the narrow space between bunks, the floorboards biting cold against his feet. He folded his blanket into a perfect square. He treated the morning roll call not as a prisoner's burden, but as a soldier's duty. But the camp refused to cooperate with his expectation of a brutal regime. The rules were baffling. There was no forced labor. There was no daily ritual of humiliation. The guards were not cruel. They were, almost worse, indifferent. They enforced the perimeter, counted the heads, and managed the distribution of food. The food itself was a psychological assault. It was plentiful, but strange. They were served thick, dark rye bread that tasted sour to Kenji. Nothing like the white rice of home. There was milk. There were potatoes. There was coffee, thin and bitter, but hot. He ate it all, mechanically, forcing down the unfamiliar textures, his contempt growing. It was the food of cattle, not warriors. 2 weeks into his internment, the camp commandant, a major who looked more like a weary schoolteacher than a soldier, announced the voluntary work program. A notice was posted in the mess hall, translated poorly into German and Japanese. Under the Articles of the Geneva Convention, prisoners, below the rank of officer, though officers could volunteer, were permitted to work for pay. The pay was not in dollars, but in camp scrip, usable at the canteen for items like soap, cigarettes, or chocolate. The work, the notice explained, was primarily agricultural, helping local farmers whose sons were overseas. A schism immediately formed in Barracks C. "It is collaboration," Kenji stated flatly that night, his voice cutting through the whispers. He sat on his bunk, rigid, staring at the wall. "But, Lieutenant," Toshiro countered, his voice small, "they say we can buy." "It is helping them," Kenji snapped. "You will plant their crops. You will harvest their food. You will free another American farmer to go kill your brothers in the Pacific. It is treason. End for. One peef. End for." His words hung in the cold air. But the next morning, Toshiro and a dozen others shuffled forward, volunteering for the work detail. Kenji watched them go, his face a mask of stone. He felt a profound sense of betrayal, not by the Americans, but by his own men. With the barracks suddenly half empty during the day, the silence amplified Kenji's isolation. He refused the privilege of work. His duty, he decided, was to resist this soft corruption. He discovered the library. It was a small room in the recreation hut, smelling of dry paper and stove smoke. It was run by a quiet American corporal and filled mostly with donations. Western novels, agricultural manuals, and stacks of National Geographic. Kenji, educated in English before the war, found himself drawn to it. He told himself it was to study the enemy, to understand his mind. He checked out a book, not a novel, but a history of the American Civil War. He was issued a library card, a small piece of processed cardboard with his name and number typed on it. He held the library card in his hand back in the barracks. It was such a small, mundane object, a symbol of civilian life, of trust, a tool for education. Why would they give this to him? They were arming his mind, not breaking it. He sat on his bunk, the dark rye bread from lunch sitting heavy in his stomach, and stared at the library card. He hated it. He hated the insidious comfort, the confusing rules, the way the camp was eroding his certainty, replacing the sharp, clean lines of hatred with a blurry, unsettling ambiguity. He would not work. He would read, and he would wait. The cold intensified. By mid-December, it had become a living entity, a constant pressure against the thin tar paper walls. The wind no longer howled, it screamed, a high-pitched, unending siren that frayed the nerves of every man in Barracks C. And with the deepening cold came the rumors. The word was Christmas. It began with the German prisoners, who were seen erecting a small, bare tree near their mess hall. But in the Japanese barracks, the word held no context of celebration. It was a foreign ritual, and therefore, a threat. It is a day of sacrifice for their god, one infantryman whispered, his eyes wide in the gloom. They will honor it with severity. Kenji dismissed it as hysteria. But the atmosphere in the camp had changed. The guards, usually defined by their profound boredom, were now tense. They were irritable. Roll call was shorter, sharper. Their voices cracked with an anger that had been absent before. Kenji, the observer, watched them from behind the wire. He saw them huddled around the radio in their guard hut, listening intently. He did not know that halfway across the world, in the forests of Belgium, the American army was suffering one of its worst setbacks of the war. He did not know the words, Battle of the Bulge, or that the casualty lists filtering back to the Nebraska newspapers were growing tragically long. He only knew that the men holding the rifles were agitated. And an agitated enemy was an unpredictable one. The fear solidified in Toshiro. The young radio operator stopped eating. He would sit on his bunk, shivering, staring at the slice of dark rye bread he was given, unable to lift it to his mouth. "Lieutenant," he whispered to Kenji one night, his teeth chattering. I heard they are building something in the kitchens. Something special for us." "Silence," Kenji commanded, though his own stomach was tight. "Do not spread panic. We are soldiers. We are prisoners," Toshiro choked out, tears freezing on his cheeks. "They will make a sport of us." The fear was becoming more dangerous than the cold. Kenji needed an answer. He needed to know what form the severity would take. He found his answer 3 days before the holiday. He was returning from the library hut, his copy of The Red Badge of Courage tucked inside his PW jacket, when a supply truck rumbled past him, sliding in the muddy ice. It backed up to the main mess hall kitchen. Kenji stopped, moving into the shadow of his barracks to watch. American privates, cursing the cold, jumped from the back. They began unloading the cargo. It was not ammunition. It was not more barbed wire. They were birds. Dozens of them. Large, pale, and frozen solid as stones. They were plucked, headless, wrapped in paper. Turkeys. Kenji recognized them instantly from the pages of the magazines in the library. The pieces clicked into place in his mind, forming a terrible, logical picture. The guards' anger. The massive delivery of festive food. The rumors of something special in the kitchens. Kenji felt a coldness unrelated to the wind. His fear did not vanish, but rather crystallized into a hard, sharp rage. He knew. He walked back into Barracks C, the sound of the thudding, frozen turkeys hitting the loading dock, echoing in his ears. Toshiro looked up at him, desperate. "Lieutenant? What is it?" Kenji looked at the terrified faces in the barracks. "They are preparing a feast," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The men stared, confused. Their feast, Kenji clarified, the anger burning in his chest. And they will need servants to cook it. The humiliation. That was the punishment. Not a quick bullet, but a slow degradation. They would be forced into the kitchens, officers and enlisted men alike, reduced to slaves to prepare the celebration meal for their masters. The night of December 24th arrived. The sun vanished, plunging the plains into an icy darkness. The men in Barracks C sat in silence, waiting. The barracks door slammed open. A young private stood in the frame, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Block C, dinner detail. On your feet. This was it. The private's shout was sharp, metallic in the frigid air. On your feet. Move. Men scrambled from their bunks. The sound of boots hitting the wooden floor was a hollow percussion of panic. Toshiro, beside Kenji, made a small, choked sound. He was vibrating, his teeth chattering from more than the cold. Lieutenant. Toshiro whispered, his voice cracking. Like the stories from China. They will make a sport of us. Kenji rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. The contact was firm, almost harsh. Show them nothing. He spoke the words to steady the boy, but his own stomach was a knot of acid. He knew what was coming. The humiliation. The turkeys, he had seen them unload. The guards' recent agitation. It all pointed to this. They would be forced into aprons. Forced to serve their masters. It was a refined cruelty. Perfectly suited to the soft enemy he had come to observe. Move it! The guard shoved the barracks door open wider, letting the lethal Nebraska cold flood the room, extinguishing the stove's meager warmth in an instant. They spilled out into the night. The cold was absolute. It was not like the wet chill of the sea. This was a dry, airless cold that seemed to suck the life from the lungs. Kenji pulled his PW jacket tight, but the wind cut through the coarse wool as if it were paper. The ground was frozen iron, and the crunch, crunch, crunch of 50 pairs of boots on the icy snow was the only sound. A ragged rhythm of dread. The camp was illuminated by the harsh, unblinking floodlights on the perimeter fences, casting long, distorted shadows that danced ahead of them. But ahead, the mess hall, usually a dark, silent shape by this hour, was blazing with light. Yellow, warm light spilled from every window, staining the snow around it a pale gold. Kenji kept his eyes fixed forward. He focused on the mechanics of walking. Left foot. Right foot. He would not stumble. He would not give them the satisfaction of his fear. He had faced American fighters in the sky, felt the thud of their cannons against his fuselage. He would face this. He would cook their food. He would serve their feast. He would endure the shame, and he would lock it away. Death would have been cleaner. This was a calculated degradation, a way to break their spirit where the cold and the wire could not. They were marched in two lines, guards walking parallel, rifles held ready but not aimed. Kenji noted the guards were tense, but not brutal. They weren't using their rifle butts, just their voices, sharp and quick. Keep it closed up. They approached the mess hall. The distance was perhaps only 100 meters, but it felt like a marathon. As they drew closer, something new cut through the sterile smell of ice and the faint tang of coal smoke. A new smell. Kenji frowned, his stride faltering for a half step. He had braced himself for the metallic, greasy smell of a working kitchen, the institutional odor of boiling water and raw, frozen meat. This was different. It was rich. It was savory. He smelled herbs he could not name, something like pine and pepper. He smelled roasted meat. Not boiling. Roasting. They stopped at the door. The guards barked a command. Halt. The door was pulled open by a private stationed inside. A wall of heat and scent hit them. Kenji froze. The sensation was so overpowering it was disorienting. The smell was not a threat. It was thyme, sage, onions, and the unmistakable, deep, rich aroma of cooked turkey. It is already cooked. The thought was a physical shock, landing with more force than a blow. If it is cooked, what are we for? He stared into the bright doorway, his mind racing, trying to reconfigure the threat. He could see long tables. He could see decorations? A trap. It had to be a trap. This was a prelude to the true humiliation. Move it, Tanaka. Get inside. A shove from behind. Kenji stumbled forward, crossing the threshold from the lethal cold into the bewildering, impossible warmth. The warmth was the first violation. It was a dense, physical wave of heat that fogged Kenji's mind and plastered his thin PW shirt to his shoulder blades. After weeks of debilitating cold that had seeped into his bones, the sudden, humid warmth of the mess hall felt like a physical blow, a sensory ambush. His eyes, stinging from the transition, slowly adjusted to the light. He scanned the room, his training screaming at him to identify the threat, the trap, the humiliation. There was none. The long wooden tables were bare, but they were clean. Draped clumsily between the bare ceiling rafters were strings of green pine boughs. They looked ridiculous, an almost childish attempt at decoration. Their sharp, clean scent mixed oddly with the overwhelming, savory aroma of roasted meat and gravy. He searched for the guards, expecting them to be lining the walls, rifles ready, faces grinning in anticipation of the show. He found them. They were standing behind the long, stainless steel serving counter, exactly where Kenji had expected to be forced to stand himself. But they were not guarding. They were wearing white kitchen aprons, absurdly civilian tied over their army uniforms. Kenji recognized Sergeant Miller. A man whose voice at morning roll call was like gravel in a tin can. Miller was currently holding a large, slotted spoon, glaring into a steaming vat of peas, as if it had personally insulted him. Near the kitchen entrance, standing apart, was the camp commandant, Major Harrison. He was a tall, thin man who always looked weary. He was not armed. His hands were clasped neatly behind his back, and he was simply watching. He was not overseeing a punishment. He was observing a procedure. And on. Also, Kenji felt the ground shift beneath him. All his preparation, all the mental armor he had built to withstand brutality, was useless. He had prepared his mind for the kick, the spit, the slur. He had steeled himself for starvation, for violence, for death. He had no defense against this bizarre, organized, almost gentle bureaucracy of food. The confusion was a more profound disorientation than the cold. He felt exposed, his hatred suddenly irrelevant. "Line up! Grab a tray!" a corporal shouted. His voice was impatient, but it was the impatience of a man who wanted a job finished, not the malice of a torturer. The line of Japanese prisoners shuffled forward, a ragged column of gray uniforms moving with the jerky uncertainty of men walking into a minefield. Toshiro was just ahead of Kenji, his eyes wide and vacant, his body trembling so hard he could barely walk. As Toshiro reached for a tray, his foot caught on the leg of a bench that had been pushed aside. He stumbled, losing his balance and crashing hard against the steel counter. The stack of tin trays clattered loudly to the floor. Silence fell. Every prisoner froze. Kenji tensed, his hand balling into a fist. This was it. The moment the mask of civility would drop. Toshiro cowered, raising an arm to shield his face. Sergeant Miller looked up, his face dark with annoyance. He stalked over to Toshiro. He did not raise his hand. He did not raise his voice. He simply grabbed Toshiro by the collar of his PW jacket and hauled him roughly back to his feet. "Watch your step, son." Miller grumbled, his voice a low growl. He straightened the boy's jacket, his movements firm, but not violent. "You'll spill the food." Kenji stopped breathing. "Son." The word echoed in his head. It was not Jap. It was not prisoner. It was not Tojo. It was son. A word of casual, almost paternal, correction. The word a tired, impatient father might use for a clumsy child. The absolute, profound lack of hatred in that single word was more shocking than a rifle butt to the teeth. Toshiro, pale and trembling, picked up a tray. The line moved. Kenji, his mind numb, followed. He was detached, watching himself as if from a great distance. He felt the heat of the steam tables on his face. He smelled the pine and the rich, roasted turkey. He picked up a tray. He picked up a fork. He moved forward. His military discipline the only thing keeping his legs from buckling. He stopped in front of the first man in the line, the man holding the largest carving knife. Sergeant Miller. Kenji stood before Sergeant Miller. He held his tray, a thin piece of pressed tin, against his chest. It was a shield. He kept his eyes lowered, focused on the counter, bracing himself. He expected Miller to spit in his food, to throw scraps at him, to make a comment that would sever his last thread of dignity. Miller was sweating from the heat of the serving line. The white apron over his uniform was already stained. He was carving a massive, perfectly browned turkey with an almost savage efficiency. Kenji watched the knife. It was large, sharp, and confident. Miller sliced deep into the breast, the blade sliding through the meat, releasing a puff of steam that carried the rich scent of thyme and pepper directly into Kenji's face. Miller looked up. His eyes, small and tired under the brim of his cap, met Kenji's. There was no hatred in them. There was no pity. There was only the weary impatience of a man performing a repetitive task. Kenji flinched, expecting the insult. Miller simply gestured with the carving knife. "Plate." Kenji mechanically extended his tin tray. Then, it happened. Sergeant Miller plunged a large, two-pronged fork into the meat he had just cut. He lifted not a scrap, not a discarded piece of skin, but a thick, impossibly white, perfectly roasted slice of turkey. The slice was half an inch thick. Juice beaded on its surface and dripped back onto the carcass. Miller placed the slice of turkey gently onto the center of Kenji's tray. It landed with a soft, wet sound. Kenji stared at it. This was the punishment. This was the humiliation. This was the ritual of dominance. A piece of meat so tender, so valuable, that many American families, he knew this from the magazines in the library, were sacrificing for the war effort, using ration stamps for sugar and butter, while he, the enemy, was being served it. He could not compute the action. His mind, trained to interpret American actions through the lens of brutality, simply stopped. This is how they punish prisoners? The question was a silent scream in his skull. It was not a question of confusion. It was a question of existential terror. If this was punishment, his entire world was wrong. If this was not punishment, but kindness, the implications were even more terrifying. A kindness he could not repay, did not deserve, and could not understand. It was a power he had no defense against. He stood frozen, blocking the line. "Move, Lieutenant," Miller grumbled. The title lieutenant was the second blow. Miller knew his rank. He was not Jap, he was not prisoner 804, he was lieutenant. They were acknowledging his status as an officer while serving him a feast. A private next to Miller, seeing Kenji stalled, took initiative. He scooped a large spoonful of white, fluffy mashed potatoes and plopped it next to the turkey. A second scoop added a cascade of brown gravy, which pooled against the meat. A third added the green peas Miller had been glaring at. The tray was heavy. It was hot. The heat radiated up through the tin, warming Kenji's frozen hands. He looked at the plate. Turkey, potatoes, gravy, peas. A meal from a picture in the Saturday Evening Post. Go on, Miller said, finally looking at him again. Merry Christmas, Lieutenant. Kenji could not move. He could not speak. His throat was closed. He felt a shove from behind. Toshiro, or another prisoner, bumping into him. He stumbled forward, away from the serving line, his eyes still locked on the impossible object on his tray. The turkey steamed gently in the warm air. He had prepared for a fight. For blood. He had received a feast. He felt a terrifying, unfamiliar emotion rising in his chest. Not anger, not fear, but a profound, suffocating shame. Kenji moved like a man in a dream. He found an empty spot at one of the long wooden tables, far from the warmth of the serving line, near a window where the cold seeped through the glass. He sat. The tin tray was still hot against his fingertips. He stared at the food. The turkey slice was thick, glistening with juice. The gravy had formed a small, brown lake against the white dam of potatoes. The peas were a vibrant, almost artificial green. It was a perfect plate, a plate of propaganda. He looked around. The other 49 prisoners were in a similar state of paralysis. They sat, trays before them, but few were eating. They glanced at each other, then at the guards who were now serving themselves, laughing among each other at the end of the line, then back at their food. They were waiting for the trick, waiting for the command, waiting for the other boot to drop. But no command came. Kenji's military discipline, the core of his being, provided the only available script. When food is issued, you eat it. He picked up the fork. The metal was thin and cheap. He pressed the tines into the edge of the turkey. The meat gave way with almost no resistance, flaking apart, revealing the moist, tender grain within. He put the small piece in his mouth. The flavor was the final assault. It was rich. It was savory. It was salty and seasoned with herbs he had only smelled from a distance. It was delicious. And that deliciousness was an agony. With that single bite, Kenji was overwhelmed by a wave of guilt so profound it threatened to suffocate him. He thought, instantly, of his squadron, of men he had shared rice with, men now dead. He thought of the soldiers still fighting in the jungles of New Guinea or the Philippines, starving, eating roots and insects, dying of dysentery while their bodies wasted away. And here he sat, in the heart of the enemy's land, eating a feast. He felt a hot surge of self-loathing. This was worse than torture. Torture he could have resisted with honor. This was a corruption. He was participating in his own disgrace, and the proof was the savory taste still on his tongue. He looked across the table. Toshiro was eating. The young man was eating with a desperate, animal-like speed. His shoulders shaking, tears streamed silently down his face, dripping from his chin onto his PW jacket. He was not crying from fear. It was something else, gratitude, or relief, or a complete shattering of his mental state. Kenji could not tell. He only knew it was a sound of surrender. Kenji looked back at his own plate. This is their weapon. He understood it, then. The warm barracks. The medical care. The library card. The absurd politeness of Lieutenant. And now, this meal. It was not kindness. It was a strategy. It was the soft power he had read whispers of. A psychological campaign to make them weak, to make them question their emperor, their nation, their cause. They are trying to buy our souls. He searched for the malice in it. He tried to see the guards' actions as a form of mockery. Look at you, enemy. You are so weak, so broken. We can feed you like pets. But he could not find that malice. He remembered Sergeant Miller's gruff, tired voice. Watch your step, son. The casual, unthinking humanity of it. The absence of ideology. The sun. He took another bite of turkey. And another. He ate, forcing it down, not in hunger, but in a cold, analytical fury. He would study this weapon as he studied their aircraft. He would consume it, understand its mechanics, and he would not let it break him. The hall remained silent, save for the scraping of 50 forks on 50 tin trays. It was the loudest silence Kenji had ever known. When the meal was over, Major Harrison stepped forward. He did not make a speech. He did not gloat. "You will return your trays to the kitchen window," he said, his voice flat, projecting easily in the quiet. "And then, return to your barracks. That is all. No humiliation. No demands. No propaganda." The punishment was over. The prisoners stood, deposited their trays, and were marched back out into the freezing Nebraska night, the taste of turkey and confusion burning in their throats. Sleep did not come. Kenji lay rigid on his straw mattress, the barracks thick with the sound of restless men. The heat from the pot-bellied stove did not reach his bunk, and the familiar, biting cold returned, but it could not touch the turmoil inside him. The phantom taste of the turkey lingered, a rich, savory ghost that mocked his convictions. He replayed the evening endlessly. Sergeant Miller's gruff "Son," the weight of the hot plate, the absence of the expected violence. He had analyzed it as a strategy, a form of soft power designed to break their will. But this explanation felt thin, insufficient. It did not account for the weariness in Major Harrison's eyes, or the genuine, clumsy effort of the pine boughs. He had come expecting devils, but he had found only men. Tired, impatient, complicated men. The next morning, Christmas Day, dawned brittle and gray. There was no special announcement. Roll call was held as usual. The guards stamping their feet against the cold, their voices thick, perhaps from holiday drinking. The routine was a small comfort, a return to the predictable. Kenji felt a gnawing restlessness. The library. He needed the silence of the library. He found the small hut blessedly empty, save for the American corporal who managed it. A quiet man with glasses. The corporal was nursing a cup of coffee, the aroma mixing with the smell of old paper and coal smoke. He was reading the local newspaper. Kenji moved quietly to the shelves, pulling a book at random, his eyes not on the spine but on the newspaper. He pretended to browse, moving closer. The corporal finished his coffee, grunted, and stood up, leaving the paper spread open on his small desk as he went to check the stove. Kenji's eyes scanned the headlines. He saw news from Europe, names of Belgian towns he did not recognize, but the tone was grim. He saw local advertisements. And then, on the right-hand side of the front page, he saw the editorial column. The headline was stark, set in angry, bold type. "Why are we feasting our enemies?" Kenji froze. He leaned closer, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. He read the words, his English comprehension sharp enough to grasp the fury. The article was a letter, penned by a local woman. It spoke of her son, a boy of 19, killed in action near Aachen. It spoke of ration stamps, of families doing without sugar and meat, so that this great nation can win the war. And then the rage turned toward Camp Atlanta. "And yet I am told," the letter spat, "that on Christmas Eve, the very Japs and Krauts who killed my boy were served a full turkey dinner. This is not justice. It is a betrayal of every mother who has given a son. It is a disgrace to this county. And Major Harrison should be ashamed for coddling the men who would, if given the chance, put a bayonet in his back." "Ken." A guard was at the door. "No prisoners in the rec hut. Back to your barracks." "No." Kenji placed the book back on the shelf, his movements calm, automatic. He gave a slight bow to the corporal, who just waved him away, and stepped back out into the cold. But the world had changed. He looked across the compound, past the wire, to the small, plain building marked Commandant. The turkey dinner. It had not been a simple government policy. It had not been a unanimous, strategic decision. It had been a choice. It had been an act of defiance. Major Harrison had fed them, not with the support of his community, boop against its will. He had absorbed their hatred, shielding his prisoners from the fury of the grieving woman and the anger of the town. He had enforced the Geneva Convention, not because it was easy, but because it was difficult. Kenji stood in the snow, the wind cutting at his face. His carefully constructed image of the enemy, a single, monstrous entity, cracked, and then shattered. He saw them now. The furious, grieving mother. The bored, tired sergeant. The principled, weary major. The enemy was not one thing. They were fractured. They were at war with him. And also, with themselves. This realization was colder, sharper, and more profound than the Nebraska wind. The next morning, the call came for the voluntary work details. The men who went to the local farms. Kenji, who had held himself apart in silent, rigid protest, looked at Toshiro. He picked up his gloves. "Lieutenant?" Toshiro asked, his voice full of disbelief. Kenji Tanaka nodded once, his face set. He walked out of the barracks and, for the first time, joined the line. The morning of the work detail was bright and impossibly cold. The sky, a harsh, metallic blue. Kenji stood in the morning roll call. His decision from the previous day settled deep in his stomach like a stone. When the sergeant called for the Arbeitskommando, the voluntary labor detail, Kenji stepped forward. A ripple of movement, of shock, passed through the Japanese prisoners. Toshiro gasped, then quickly stepped forward himself, positioning himself behind his officer. Several others, who had previously refused, saw their lieutenant move and reluctantly followed. But the hardliners, the older, career soldiers who huddled near the stove in Barracks C, did not move. Their eyes followed Kenji. He felt the weight of their judgment. He was an officer. He was disgracing his rank, his uniform. He was, in their eyes, a collaborator. Kenji ignored them. His definition of honor had been thrown into chaos by a single slice of turkey and a newspaper headline. He was no longer certain what betrayal looked like. The work details were organized near the administration hut. A different sergeant, one Kenji did recognize, stood with a clipboard, dividing the prisoners. You, and you, he said, pointing to the Germans. Potato seller. You, pointing to a group of Japanese. Farm detail. Johnson's place. Loading feed. The sergeant looked at Kenji, eyeing his officer insignia, which was still faintly visible on his faded PW jacket. Officers ain't required, Lieutenant. You can go back to the barracks. I volunteer, Kenji said. His voice was rough from disuse, his English precise. The sergeant shrugged. Suit yourself. We need hands on the Johnson farm. No, Kenji said. The sergeant stopped, annoyed. No. This is voluntary, Lieutenant. But the assignment is not. I request, library, Kenji said, pointing toward the small recreation hut. The sergeant stared at him as if he were insane. The library? That ain't work. That's reading? The quiet corporal who ran the library, the one whose newspaper Kenji had read, happened to be walking past, carrying a bucket of coal for his stove. He stopped. He's right, Sergeant, the corporal said, adjusting his glasses. He's in there every day anyway. The place is a mess. I got a shipment of donated books I can't read. He gestured to a stack of boxes, some marked with German lettering. I can use him. The sergeant, clearly wanting to be rid of the confusing situation, waved his hand in disgust. Fine. One man, library. Don't make trouble, Tanaka. Kenji gave a sharp, formal bow. He turned and walked away from the main group, leaving Toshiro to be herded toward the farm truck. He walked alone across the compound. This was the true act of separation. He was not helping their war effort by planting crops. He was doing something else. Something for himself. He was stepping inside their minds. He entered the hut. It was warmer than the barracks. Quieter. The corporal pointed to the pile of dusty boxes. Sort 'em. Anything in German goes to the Kraut barracks. Anything in English goes on the shelf. Anything else. Burn it. Kenji nodded. He spent the morning in silence, the only sound, the scrape of boxes and the rustle of paper. He found German Bibles, Japanese newspapers from 3 years prior, which he placed in the burn pile, and stacks of American magazines. He worked through lunch, ignoring the call for the midday meal. He was driven by a new kind of hunger. He was not seeking friendship. He was not seeking absolution. He was seeking comprehension. He needed to understand a people who were, at the same moment, capable of the brutal rage he read in the editorial, and the disciplined, inexplicable humanity of the Christmas dinner. He needed to understand the power behind the turkey. Late in the afternoon, the corporal left, leaving Kenji alone in the quiet, dusty room. His task was done. The boxes were empty. He walked to the language shelf. He passed the French dictionaries and the German primers. He found what he was looking for. It was a small, thin book bound in dark blue cloth. Its title was simple: A Beginner's Grammar of the English Language. He took it from the shelf. He sat at the corporal's small desk, the smell of coal smoke and old paper filling his senses. He opened the book to the first page. The first heading was simple: Almost Elemental. Chapter 1. The verb to be. Beneath it were the first conjugations: I am, you are, he is. Kenji Tanaka, lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Navy, prisoner of war, stared at the words. He picked up the pencil left on the desk, wet the tip of his tongue, and, for the first time, began to learn.